Once upon a time, there was a village, and one day, one warm afternoon, a couple of villagers noticed in the river a child was in the river drowning. And so the villagers went and rescued the child out of the water, began performing CPR, and one of them noticed there were two more children in the river. And so they cried out for help, and more villagers came, and they pulled those children out of the water, began performing CPR. And what do you know, but they looked over, and there were more children, 3, 4, 5 children in the river, and screaming out. The whole village went out to try to rescue these children, and they pulled them out of the river and began to try to attend to them. And one of the villagers began to walk upstream. The other villagers looked at that woman and said, "Hey, are you here to tend to these children?" She said, "Yes, there are plenty of you to tend to those children, but I'm going to walk upstream and see why these children are falling in the river in the first place." This is a story attributed to Desmond Tutu, the bishop from South Africa. When we think about this golden rule that we've been focused on for a couple of weeks now, the easiest, the simplest way to do unto others is to do one-to-one sort of personal kindnesses that I can extend to you, that you can extend to me, that we can extend to our neighbor or the person in the grocery store line. Simple, one-to-one personal acts of kindness. But what Tutu was getting at in this story is that if we can change systems to eliminate groups of people from suffering, that's kindness on a macro scale instead of a micro scale. And we do kindnesses on the micro scale all the time. That's the one-to-one sort of micro kindnesses. But when we can, we should walk upstream and see why those children are falling in the river in the first place, and take care of the systemic issue that's making those kids fall in the river. So maybe there's a guy up there throwing kids off the bridge into the river, and so you want to go and punch him in the nose. Or maybe something less violent, and the railing is broken, and the children are simply falling off the bridge, and so you fix the railing. You fix the problem that causes the suffering in the first place. When I was working in eastern Kentucky, I was part of the Rural Poverty Initiative, trying to eradicate poverty in 20 of the poorest counties in the United States. And so that was interesting work, and 2 of the poorest counties in the United States, at least at that time, were in Kentucky, and so I was working in those 2 counties. And we would do all kinds of things. You know, one of the things that we would do would be helping people fix up their homes, right? And so we would fix up the home, and then it would burn down. Okay, it was laborious, heartbreaking sometimes work. And one of the things that I learned is, yes, it's great to help people with their immediate needs. If they're hungry, feed them. Absolutely. That's kind of the one-to-one kindness. But thinking deeply about why people are hungry in the first place and trying to do something about that, that's macro kindness, isn't it? Kindness on a much larger scale. It's harder to tackle. But if we're doing unto others, we've got to think in systemic ways as well as one-to-one, more personal ways. The prophet Micah, in this Old Testament book, Micah's a prophet, and he's kind of wondering how he can please God. And we kind of get to hear his inner thinking, right? And he's at a time where sacrifices of all kinds are required by their religion, and he's challenging that thinking. And he says, does God require us to sacrifice a year-old calf? That's the first one. That was a very common sacrifice at the time. And then he kind of asks the next question, well, okay, that maybe then 10,000 rams, he says. Then 10,000 rivers of oil, he says. Will God be pleased with that? Then he asks, will God be pleased if I sacrifice my firstborn child? Child sacrifice wasn't uncommon in that day. Some of you, like me, may have been tempted to sacrifice your firstborn. Does God require me to sacrifice my firstborn child in order to please God? And this is my paraphrase, but Micah says, come on, people, really? Here's what God requires of you. Not all of that sacrifice. No need to bring 10,000 rams to sacrifice on the altar before God. Here's what God requires of us. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with God. That's it. And so we can love kindness, and you guys here at Chapel are some of the kindest people I've ever known in my entire life. This is a church of kind, generous people. The harder thing for us to figure out is the justice piece. And justice, the way Micah is using it, is simply a macro kindness. It's systemic kindness. It's kindness that takes resources from all over and filters them into kindnesses that become personal. Let me see if I can explain this concept using something we're too familiar with in this community and maybe tired of talking about or hearing about. But there were a couple of hurricanes that came through recently. In fact, last week or the week before, I invited congregation members to share some of the kindnesses that you've witnessed firsthand. What was that, last Sunday? Sunday before. It was 2 weeks ago. All right. And my heart was warmed as many of you shared kindnesses that you were the recipient of or that you witnessed. That's the one-on-one kind of kindnesses I'm talking about. It's, hey, come stay at my place through the storm, or hey, I know your house was destroyed. Can I do some loads of laundry for you? Or can I bring you a meal? Or hey, here's a bunch of gift cards, Pastor, to give out to the community. I mean, these are heartwarming, important good work that you have witnessed and been a part of. But I want to share a junction of macro kindness and the micro kindness that we're so familiar with. A couple of weeks ago, I was helping this woman find temporary housing. She was living in her car after her home was destroyed by the storm, and somebody told me about her, and I introduced myself to her, and I said, I don't know if I can help you find housing, but let me try. And she had been approved through FEMA for temporary housing. And we have a relationship with the Fairfield Inn that's just a couple of blocks north of here. And so we kind of called our friends there and told the manager the woman's story, and they said, let us see what we can do. And they kind of moved heaven and earth to find this woman a room in the Fairfield. And I went with this lady as she was checking in, and they were helping her with all of her FEMA process, and it's kind of complicated, and I haven't had to deal with it personally. Some of you have. And as they were checking her in, I was talking with the staff, including the manager, Liz. And Liz was telling me that they had never been a FEMA site before. Watching their neighbors on North Beach and beyond suffer the way that they have. Their hearts, she and her staff, they were like, whatever we can do to help our neighbors. Our neighbors are going to need to be somewhere safe so they can tend to their homes here on North Beach. And so we don't know how to be a FEMA site. We don't know anything about it, but we're going to do it. We're going to become a FEMA site. And so they did, having no idea really what it would involve, how much work it would be on them. They were going to do it. They're going to open up their hotel to their neighbors in need. And as they told me this story, I'm getting teary-eyed again. They didn't have to do that. They would have been completely filled up without being a FEMA site. And I said, so has FEMA been good to pay you? And they were like, we don't know yet. We hope they are. So this is the intersection of a personal kindness, the staff watching their neighbors suffer, and tapping into a systemic kindness, even as imperfect as it may be, called FEMA. That's FEMA, the tax dollars from Missouri and Iowa and Montana and Florida coming to help many of us here in need. It's a systemic kindness. It's called justice, is what the prophet Micah calls it. And what does the Lord require of you but do justice, love kindness, walk humbly. Let's talk about that third piece of that equation. Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly. I think that there is an epidemic in this country, and it's called lack of humility. I think we could really grow in that way as a nation. Humility is an understanding of our own limitations, and maybe over this past month, you've kind of had to find your humility as you've run into your own limitations. I know I have. Seeing so many of my church family and others suffering, I would just so much love to snap my finger and fix everything, and I just can't. And I don't like that, and it's kind of forcing humility upon me. And I was commiserating with a parishioner, one of you, and he was also the same mindset. Man, I wish I could just snap my finger and fix everything for everybody. And he gave me this piece of sage advice that was told to him, and now I share it with you. And the sage advice was this: do for one what you would like to do for all. That's humility, right? We recognize maybe as one single person can't do for everybody, but I can be kind and extend kindness to one person at a time. As I encounter people who have needs or wants or in suffering, and I do for one what you would do for all. And that's micro kindness. But I want to add a part B to that, which is getting into the macro kindness. Do for one what you would do for all, and if you can do for all, then do it. Do the work of walking upstream and seeing why everyone is suffering and stop it at its source. Stop the suffering at its source. Be people who make systemic changes to eliminate and eradicate human suffering wherever we might find it. God's favorite math equation is pretty simple. And if you love math, a couple of folks. God's favorite math equation is very simple. Kindness plus justice times humility equals God's requirement. And that's really all God expects from us. No 10,000 cattle or rivers of oil, no sacrificing our firstborn even when we want to. What does God require us but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God? That's what God requires. And I suggest we get busy doing it. Amen.